can start? Yeah, let's begin, Prof. It will catch us along the way. You think so?
Yeah.
Let's trust and believe that more people are going to come. So
Yeah, no, then they can just
catch us along the way.
catch up.
All right. Marco, you can go live. Do I call you immediately? I'll just do the hello and whatever
Yes,
and then
yes,
call you.
yes.
Sure, no problem. I would like to call the House to order, please. Like to call the House to order, please. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Vuyobonga Ndodana, and I'll be your program director for today. Just a few housekeeping rules. Can we please put our phones on silent and put them on vibrate? And yeah, we will proceed shortly. So just a few apologies for the slight delay in the program. We were experiencing a few technical difficulties and we are expecting a few students that are still in class. We are going to proceed right now. And without wasting any time, I would like to call upon Professor Christy van der Westhuizen to come and do the opening and welcoming for us. Let's give her a round of applause.
Thanks so much, Vuyo, and very good to be with you today. Thanks to the students that have joined us so far. And I must say it's a real pleasure to have another joint event with our Department of History and Political Studies. I must say it's, for us at the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy, it's been a really good relationship to build. And thanks to you, Professor Breakfast, also for making that possible. Really appreciate it. And then we will also have our discussant, Thomas de Blanche, from the department today. So for us, this is a very good collaboration, and we really appreciate this opportunity to bring greater insight, intellectual insight, in areas that sometimes do not get the requisite kind of attention, or sometimes become beholden to flippancies and cliches. And I think when we think about the question of the African Union, and I think that there's a kind of a cynicism about the African Union as an institution, it's very important for us to, when we critique an institution, when we try and understand an institution and so on, that we actually do embed what we say and what the criticism that we offer in actual facts and solid research and analysis. And that's why I'm very happy that we can welcome yet again Professor Dr. Ulf Engel from Leipzig University, who is with us today, again after visiting us about almost a year ago exactly. And Ulf has really spent so many years, I don't want to say your life, but you spent several years trying to understand how aspects of the African Union operate and work. And last year we actually had a really fruitful engagement on the question of the African Union at 20 years. And what struck me of your presentation last year was how you spoke about all the different kinds of dimensions that one has to take into account if one wants to understand the operation of the African Union, including internal dynamics, including global conditions, including whether the institution itself advances when measured against the terms of globalization. So I think we had it opened the door for us actually beautifully to today's discussion, where we will be digging into mechanisms inside the African Union that speak to actually some of the most controversial issues actually in the African context. So if we think about the very powerful idea of Pan-Africanism, and we think about the African Union as an attempt to institutionalize, to create an institutional form this powerful idea of Pan-Africanism, and one should actually say in the plural, because it's actually, there are also divergent ideas around what Pan-Africanism would and should mean. If we look at that, and then we look at the question of how would one institutionalize this very powerful idea, and some of the biggest hindrances and obstacles that we as people on the African continent have run up against have been, of course, the question of colonial borders. So today we're going to be hearing about the border program from Dr. Constanze Bloem, and I'm very happy to say that I'm glad that you could join us this year. You weren't with us last year, but it's going to be wonderful to hear from you on this particular issue. And Constanze has also just recently graduated with her doctorate, where she delved into various dimensions of the African Union. And I think you will be sharing some of your thoughts from your doctoral dissertation also with us today, which I'm really looking forward to. And then ultimately, the other fraught issue that we are dealing with on the African continent, and that is conflict, and how we're managing conflict, and how we're approaching and making sense of conflict, and how we're creating the conditions for, in which conflict can be resolved in other ways, in peaceful ways. And this is I think, been some of the most fraught and controversial issues on this continent. But there's definitely not been a lack of attempts to grapple exactly with the question of both borders and conflict in productive ways to try and overcome them, and to arrive at a position where Pan-Africanism then as an ideal can be more successfully realized. So, I just also want to say thank you very much to Professor Beki Mngomezulu, who's the director of CANRAD, who will also be our discussant today. Thanks a lot again for agreeing. Last year we had a wonderful conversation with you in the mix. So very happy that you could be with us now. So let me hand over to Vuyo. I'm looking forward to a robust conversation. We've allowed quite ample time also for questions and answers, because for us that's a very important part of it. I also want to acknowledge everybody that's joined us online, and we will also create the possibility for people to ask questions and comment on the online platforms, and those questions and comments will be fed into this conversation. So we'll be able to spread the net quite widely in terms of our conversation today. So thanks again for being here.
Let's give her a round of applause. Thank you very much, Prof. And before I continue, I must say, and I must declare, that I'm a bit nervous. As you can see on the program, we have some highly qualified individuals that are going to be speaking in front of us and sharing information with us. So it also is an honor for me to be facilitating this discussion. Thank you very much, Prof. Mngomezulu, and thank you very much, Prof. Christie. So before I continue, and before I call up on Professor Dr. Ulf Engel, may I kindly request Marco to please assist me, because it seems as though our projector is not working again. So as Marco comes up, I would quickly like to read the bio of Prof. Engel, and he's going to come sit next to me. Prof, I must warn you that I'm very strict on time, and I will not be entertaining any points of orders, as Madam Speaker would say. So here goes. Prof. Ulf Engel is a professor of politics in Africa at the Institute of African Studies, Leipzig University, Germany. He is also a visiting professor at the Institute for Peace and Security Studies at Addis Ababa University, Ethiopia, and a professor extraordinary in the Department of Political Science at Stellenbosch University. Together with Dr. Constance Bloem, Engel is conducting the research project, Political Populism in Southern Africa, funded by the Ministry of Education and Research 2020 to 2027. Since 2006, he has been advising the African Union Department of Political Affairs, Peace, and Security in the fields of conflict prevention, early warning, preventative diplomacy, and knowledge management. He is also the editor of the Yearbook of the African Union, Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Professor Dr. Wolf Engel. Please make your way up, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Vuyo, and thank you, Professor Christy van der Westhuizen, for the invitation. We will start by giving you a bit of background on the African Union, the African peace and security architecture, delving into two things. Recall the predecessor of the African Union, 1963 to 2002, was mainly dealing with issues of colonialism, apartheid, supporting the liberation struggles. After the end of the Cold War, 1990, this changed, and the organization went into a discourse about how to not just change the institution, but also the issues that they were addressing. And with the institutional change from the OAU to the African Union, the focus then shifted to questions of peace and security, governance, democracy, and development. And all of that is that was drafted when Zuma was at the helm of the African Union. Issues of Africa, 50 years plan how to achieve all things. But as you can see on the cartoon on the right-hand side, which is from Gado, Tanzania, he's in that part of the world as famous as Sapiro would be here in South Africa. He's showing an AU in a very bad shape in 2013 when the agenda was adopted, at least according to public perception. That seemed to have been an issue. Can we move on? So two things as background at the beginning. The AU was established in 2000 at a meeting in Durban in July, and 2 years later they adopted a protocol relating to the establishment of the Peace and Security Council, which encapsulates the so-called African Peace and Security Architecture, which is a set of institutions, norms and practices still evolving. And just to make it short here, I will talk about the smaller things that you can't read in a minute. Basically, the AU has created 5 African unions, West, North, Central, East, Southern, which are supposed to establish African standby forces for quick intervention in violent conflict. The APSA also includes 5 pillars, including the ASF, which is the Peace and Security Council, which obviously is the most important decision-making body of the AU in between meetings of the Assembly and the Executive Council. Members are 15, elected for 2 to 3 years. Currently, Namibia and just recently elected Angola and Botswana are on the PSC for the Southern African region. They are nominated by these regions. There's no veto right in contrast to the UN Security Council. And the Security Council is not only dealing with issues of peace and security, but in lack of better coordination mechanisms also, for instance, is dealing with coordinating the African climate policy, which is an interesting thing. Now, in addition to the PSC, you have the Africa Peace Fund, something that was already established in 1993. You have the Continental Early Warning System, I will talk about a bit later, and the Panel of the Wise to mediate, facilitate, and deal with conflicts at large. Can we get the next? This one is trying to locate peace and conflict interventions by the African Union on a continuum between pre-conflict, conflict, and post-conflict situations. It's based on the annual report of the PSC, the Peace and Security Council, to the AU Assembly of Heads of State and Government. And I'm just on this one, I took the year 2000, tried to locate various kinds of interventions happening between February 2019 and February 2020 in the continent. And what you can see, obviously, is that there's quite a number of pre-conflict interventions, including the AU border program, AUBP, but then there are also conflict interventions, including counterterrorism and others, and post-conflict reconstruction efforts that come together. So that is kind of the setting in which we have to locate both the Continental Early Warning System and the AU border program. Okay, thank you. So you will be facing lots of acronyms, but you're used to that living in the SADC region. But I will try to make it simple, keep it simple. And just take the next one. No, the one before, sorry. We already indicated that I have to disclose that I'm working with the African Union on these questions since 2006 on a permanent basis as an advisor paid through the German Development Agency, GIZ. I had an opportunity to work with colleagues in Addis Ababa and other places to work on the early warning architecture, not just in queues, but also in some of the regional economic communities. This picture, and Constanze will come back to it, I suppose, shows you on the left-hand side the Julius Nyerere building, which is a gift of the German people to the African Union. And on the right-hand side, the Chinese building, which is, of course, a gift of the Chinese people to the African people. Ours was more institutional, theirs is more people-to-people. The perspective that I'm taking here today is one of inner life that is based on an edited volume that colleagues and me did a couple of years ago. The English version was published in 21, the French translation last year. Working with colleagues from the continent and people who are involved as practitioners, but also as consultants, as academics, we tried to introduce new perspectives on how to study this animal African Union. And we did so from a variety of theoretical backgrounds, including, in my case, practice theory, looking at communities of practitioners, but also coming from a perspective of historical institutionalism with an interest in the making of that institution over time, but also coming from the anthropology of international organizations, working inside the institution, making your own observations over time, and then trying to make sense of some of the issues. So let me locate cues in the APSA. The original idea of early warning in the debate, and we just discussed part of it, came about in the early 1990s, following the genocide in Rwanda and also the genocides on the Balkans, when people argued that it would be far more efficient to invest into early warning rather than into peacekeeping operations or peace support operations, as they are called by the African Union. The very idea was to invest in these efforts to support what is called structural stability, that is the competence or the ability of institutions, communities, countries to deal with environmental, societal, economic stress without resorting to violent conflict. And as such, of course, early warning is meant to contribute to the building of social cohesion. This is something that Christy, Constanze, and me are working on in a different project, editing the Routledge Handbook on Social Cohesion in Africa. This article that gives an introduction can be shared, of course, through CANRAD. It is co-authored by a number of people, among others El Hassan Wan, who in those days was the incoming director, peace and security, of the African Union, later on became Vice Chief of Staff and then moved to New York, and recently has been the UN Secretary General's special envoy for Mali and the West Sahara. So let me come back to that slide that you've seen before. And I will not talk about the regions and the 5 pillars, but just about the box in the left corner, which is indicating the new Department of Political Affairs, Peace and Security, which was merged in 2021. Before that, we had a Department for Political Affairs and a separate Peace and Security Department. And due to the debate coming from the Kagame report in 2017 on the institutional reform of the African Union, some of the departments at the Union were merged, reducing the number of departments from 8 to 6, and PAPS became one of those mergers. Sorry, just go back quickly. There are 2 major departments within the department. One is the Directorate of Conflict Management on the left-hand side, which is the old PSD, Peace and Security Department, and on the right-hand side you have the Directorate for Governance and Conflict Prevention, which basically is the old Department of Political Affairs. And one of the challenges over the last 3 years, and the merger was done during COVID, was to overcome the silo mentality between these 2 blocks. And I will talk about that later in more detail. But just keep in mind that there are different institutional logics and organizational cultures meeting in this merger. Now, to take you back to the Peace and Security Protocol, a couple of institutions, importantly the 5 pillars, were introduced. Article 12 spoke about the Continental Early Warning System queues. And one has to keep in mind that in those days there was no blueprint on how to do early warning in an institution. The UN didn't have a system. The drafters of this part had certain expectations. Later on discussed with these drafters what they had in mind, but they didn't know how to do it in a technical way. And this is where I came in then. I guess 2 or 3 more remarks are important here. If you look at Article 12, paragraph 2, mentioning a situation room that is engaging in data collection and monitoring, linking this situation room to the similar rooms of the regional economic communities. The idea was, both with the Constitutive Act of the African Union and the PSC Protocol, to also rearrange the relation between the AU and the RECs. In the past, we had the Abuja Treaty 91-92 with the idea that the regional economic communities would be building blocks of African unity. This one changed with the introduction of the Constitutive Act and the transformation of the OAU to the African Union, and then also this showed in the relation between the AU and the RECs in the field of early warning and conflict prevention, where the AU chairperson and the Commissioner of Peace and Security had the obligation, the task, to coordinate and harmonize these different institutions. I can't read the small print I have. What's that? The early warning module, paragraph 4, is an interesting one, because this is what the drafters didn't know. What is an early warning module? How do you gather information? How do you translate it into conflict analysis? And how, and this is the next paragraph 5, how do you then translate that into policy recommendations for a target audience? In this case, the Commissioner of Peace and Security, the chairperson of the Commission, and the Peace and Security Council. So quite an interesting challenge. This document comes from 2002, and I will talk you through the implementation timeline in a second. Just to recall 3 main functions of the Continental Early Warning System: data collection and monitoring, on that basis peace and conflict analysis, and then coming from that, flowing from that, arriving at policy recommendations that talk to the institution, the past of the institution, and the mandate, of course. Yes. As you can see from this one, it's quite a long process, starting in 2003. And I will talk about the post-COVID situation in a second. On top, the yellow marked ones are all relating to the Peace and Security Council and certain debates and decisions taken. The bottom green is processes of thinking, having workshops, coming up with ideas, and the last one I will explain in a minute. So over time, the ambition of the queues changed from just doing early warning, addressing ongoing conflicts, trying to come up with information on possible escalations of already existing violence, towards the idea of investing into structural conflict prevention that is looking down the line 10, 15 years. What is the potential of violent conflict in a given country? And again, I'm not detailing this too much, but to probably highlight the PSC decision 360, which for the first time developed the idea how the queues could contribute to preventive diplomacy. The idea of preventive diplomacy is something that was discussed internationally since 1992 when Boutros-Boutros-Ghali, the then UN Secretary General, came up with this agenda for peace. But as you can see, not being implemented over the course of 24 years. So this was in the same year when they adopted Agenda 2063. Then the year after, we had an interesting communique on structural conflict prevention, and then the APSA roadmap was designed, which is an implementation tool for how to reach these tasks. But I also would like to indicate that there's a gap between 2008 and 2013. The first draft of the tools that are adopted in 2015 I developed in September 29. And then there was a 6-year gap because the situation was not ripe for member states to adopt that and for the PSC to take a decision on these crucial questions of how to also engage with the issue of sovereignty of member states, of course. And probably we can discuss that later. Now the last two things I would like to highlight on this slide is the CSVRA, standing for Continental Structural Vulnerability and Resilience Assessments, very technical term, but basically having an instrument similar to the APRM mechanism, African Peer Review mechanism, which was not working in those days, to address the question of peace and security. And we did a pilot in Ghana in 2017-18. Then we started, it's run on a voluntary basis, a consultative process in countries under supported by the African Union and the REC, which is responsible for that region, in this case ECOWAS, coming up with a mitigation plan how to address these crucial questions in society. The next one in line was Cote d'Ivoire, then came COVID, so it kind of stopped. Then we did Zambia, and then the commissioner lost interest in the instrument and wasn't addressing Zambia for 3 years. Now last November, or since last November, we're back on track and having finalized the Zambia report, and I understand that the next one in line would be Malawi and then Kenya, which is quite interesting. Zimbabwe has expressed an interest as well. So the last box talks to the APRM and queues, and that is now the new agenda just before the merger of the department, bringing together governance and early warning with conflict management. And this is one of the debates that is currently being held. But unfortunately, and here we are with the next one, exactly, thank you. You can, yeah. It's okay. This is showing you the new Department of Political Affairs, Peace and Security after the merger. Basically, it's an organigram drawn by a consultancy company that was tasked by the African Union to prepare the institutional reform. And as you can see at the bottom, the situation room of the queues has been kept, so data information collection was ongoing. Next one. But it also says on the site that early warning now would be mainstreamed through the regional desks, which are next to the circle. Next one. And the regional desks are actually people who work on conflict management, supporting the commission, the commissioner, and the chairperson. Not so much with analysis, but with practical things. And you have 3 regional desks for 5 regions, each staffed by 5 members. So you have 15 people dealing with the 55 member of the African Union. And on top of what they should do in terms of conflict management support, now was the idea of the commissioner that they should also engage in early warning, which they are not doing because they don't have time to do so. And because of that kind of organizational reform, next one, Q's lost a number of functions actually. The first one, there are no narrative early warning reports any longer. There's no analysis written down, deep analysis. There used to be a format of how to do so on 12 pages or so on. That's gone. It's ad hoc, whatever they can find on the internet. They're no longer developing scenarios which are the basis for policy recommendations. So in the past they went for a best case, a worst case, and a status quo scenario, and on that one aligning the tools of the AU to decision makers. That one was gone as well. The third one gone was the ability to support member states in conducting these structural vulnerability and resilience assessments. So there's a vertical disconnect, a local one, and there's finally a horizontal disconnect because there's also no longer any focal point for dealing with the regional economic communities. No? The person who was in charge of that, or a group of persons, no longer were allowed to deal with the RECs, and the AU lost an important instrument of coordinating and harmonizing the Qs and the RECs. Now, where are we now? There are 2 processes. One is top-down, coming from the commissioner. The other is bottom-up, coming from staff and the rank and file in the department. On the left-hand side, the claim is made that early warning is still conducted through the regional desks, and this is also the language that you will find in the annual reports, but it's just simply not true. And then there is a new one called IRECE, Interregional Knowledge Exchange, at the mid-year consultative meetings between, or coordination meetings between the AU and the RECs, introduced with the institutional reform, an instrument where the commissioner comes together with the executive secretaries of the different RECs. And the claim is that this would be an early warning facility, function, whatever. But it's disconnected from the department, and there's no information either from the AU nor from the RECs going into this meeting. So it's a no-brainer, basically. And to overcome this situation, people have started to rebuild relations between the Qs and the RECs, sometimes through different means, by using civil society organizations, for instance. I don't have time to go into that now, but maybe in Q&A we can talk about how civil society networks nowadays are supposed to develop their own early warning systems to link up with the RECs and then with the AU. And finally, as I indicated before, the issue of the African peer review mechanism and how to integrate that and develop an early warning function for the APM. Now, last one. What is this all about? What is the more general lesson that one can learn from that? It was a very technical thing, but this is how institutions operate. What you can see here, and this is not Africa specific, this is happening in any international organization, any regional organization, but in different ways, is a number of what IR research called pathologies of international organizations. And here I would just simply like to highlight 4 of those regarding the AU. Financial and human resources are highly constrained. There is high dependence on finance in the African Union. 66% comes from donor money. Resources are a problem. In particular with the merger, certain positions have been abolished. There is a high level of idiosyncratic influence, that is, the personality of the commissioner, of the directors of the 2 departments have a huge impact on implementation, on what is blocked, what is promoted, and the like. And all of that is usually done not with a strategic view, but rather ad hoc. There's very little institutional memory. Good people have left the institution, taken the memory with them. Some few have remained, and therefore we have a kind of organizational culture that is characterized by firefighting on the one hand, doing conflict management, mediation, pre-election observer missions, you name it. And at the same time, the rank and file is into a state of obedience, many of them just on single-year contracts, which are renewed every year. Finally, last one. I just would like to draw attention to this great yearbook. It's not of the African Union. I'm not writing on their behalf, but it's just on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. You certainly gave us a lot to chew on, and I'm quite excited that as you were speaking, I saw a number of student leaders that belong to the Pan-African student movement here on campus, so I'm pretty excited because it's going to be quite a robust discussion that we're going to have afterwards. Ladies and gentlemen, without wasting any time, thank you, by the way, Prof. Off, I would like to call upon Dr. Constance Bloom. Constance Bloom is a postdoctoral researcher at the Research Center for Global Dynamics at Leipzig University. Constance works at the Research Institute for Social Cohesion, where she focuses on transnational approaches to social cohesion and populism in Southern Africa, in particular in Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. Her PhD thesis, which was finalized in May 2023, focused on the African Union Border Program and the AU's partnership with Germany in the field of peace and security. Before joining Recent Globe in October 2020, Constance has worked in the field of rural development in Mozambique and as policy advisor for several NGOs in Berlin. She holds an MA in African Studies from Leipzig University and a BA in International Relations from the University of Geneva. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Dr. Constance Bloom. Let's give her a round of applause. The floor is yours, Doc.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction, Rio. It's a pleasure to be here and to present some of my work related to my PhD. Now, closely related to what we've just heard by Professor Engel, my input will focus on the African Union Border Program and especially the relationship between the German Development Agency, GIZ, and the African Union staff in Addis Ababa. So I'd like to share some, I guess, empirical insights on how this specific partnership between Global North and Global South plays out in that particular case. So three things I'd like to speak on that I guess are very relevant for the inner life of the AU. Now, firstly, briefly discuss the AU's external partnerships with so-called donors, but then the terminology the AU uses is partners. Then outline what the African Union Border Program does. And then finally, and I think, or we think this is a crucial point, we'd like to discuss how it's possible to approach the AU as a research kind of object. And I'll try, if I have time, to share some reflections on this. Now, the AU has or maintains partnerships with around 30 different partners, multilateral and bilateral. Sometimes a distinction is being made between, traditionally, but mainly Western partners and so-called emerging partners. The institution itself has created the label of strategic partnerships, primarily the UN, the European Union, and the League of Arab States. But in recent years, there's also been partnerships, for example, with China, Turkey, Japan, and other countries that have been kind of subsumed under that term. And as you can imagine, managing 30 partners that have different budgets, different policy fields they work in is quite a challenge for the AU. And there remains a clear discrepancy, and Professor Engel has alluded to this already, between the AU's claim to finding African solution to African problems, which is one of its guiding phrases, and then the continuous dependency mostly on European donors that fund some of its policy agenda. So that's kind of an ongoing dilemma, and you can see on the graph on the right-hand side that although initially partner funding has gone down since 2015. Over the last years, it has increased again, and I think last year it was at 62, and now I think it's 66% that were mentioned that are still contributed by partners. Now, the AU has done many steps, towards reducing this dependency and try to strengthen self-resilience, and we've noted down a couple of key decisions here, but you do still see that these partnerships continue to remain important. Now, I'd like to take you back to the AU campus, where we were just now in the previous presentation as well. So when you visit the headquarters, you see different architectural styles, and it was mentioned that most of these buildings are gifts from partners. On the left, the main conference hall by the Chinese government. On the right-hand side, German Finance, Peace and Security building. And I guess oftentimes this architectural setup serves as a symbol to highlight the continued influence by donors on the AU. But that influence actually is not as clear-cut, and we'll get into that in just a little while. We've mentioned some of this already in the previous presentation, so I'll be quick. There's still comparatively little literature available on the AU compared, for example, to the EU or the UN. And usually analysis, focus on that should versus is, so look at the AU from a deficiency kind of perspective. And the same goes for partnerships. So in my PhD, I drew from anthropological and sociological approaches to studying the AU, so looking at organizational pathologies, that can create unexpected behavior, but also looking at partnerships. It's kind of a form of social interaction. How do individuals between two organizations actually interact on a daily basis? How do they speak of each other? And then at everyday practices as well. Now, what is the AU border program? The program was founded in 2007 by AU member states. And as you all know, most of Africa's borders are relics from colonial times, so randomly drawn without regard to socioeconomic conditions, realities. Now, in order to prevent renegotiating all of these borders and creating, potential conflicts upon independence, especially in the 1960s, there was a decision by African heads of states in 1964 in the so-called Cairo Declaration to say, okay, these borders are not great, but we accept them. So despite the imperfections, the decision was made by African heads of states to keep these borders. And you can imagine that there has been quite a lot of contestations to this, but on the AU level or OAU level, this is what happened. And now the border program that then came about 40 years afterwards has the main aim to clarify these borders, which means collecting GPS coordinates, border treaties, and also to physically demarcate these borders, not in terms of walls, but using border beacons or trees or whatever material kind of fits. And originally, heads of states said that by 2012 they want to have full delimitation of intra-African borders. That deadline has consecutively been pushed back several times now to 2027, which kind of tells you also about how active member states are in pursuing that goal. There are three main activities. Oh, sorry, I forgot to. Thank you so much. So there are three main pillars of the program: delimitation and demarcation, cross-border cooperation, so fostering the connections across borders between communities, and also capacity building. And you have different levels, and this is very common to AU programs that are involved in the implementation. So you have the continental level, you have the AUBP unit in the commission that kind of coordinates, you have the regional level, you have the national level via the member states, and of course you have the border communities as well, but that unfortunately don't play a large role in the context of the program. And you have partners. The main partner is Germany, as I mentioned, that has a large-scale support program, financing since 2008, so for quite many years now. And UK and Denmark also provide support, but in a smaller manner. And so you can already see there are so many different actors involved, all of whom have quite different ideas of, about the function and meaning of borders. And just very briefly, talking about kind of partner geographies in Addis Ababa. So GIZ, the German Development Agency, has its office currently just across the street of the AU Commission. You can see on the left-hand side the GIZ office view seen from the AU Peace and Security building. So that you can see that staff can move and commute quite easily between the institutions. It's like access pass and can kind of mingle with AU staff. And so this kind of geographical proximity creates quite a close working relationship. Now, you've seen that organigram on the right-hand side. This is just to highlight that the border program was intended by the Commission as contributing to conflict prevention. And you can see until 2021, unfortunately the resolution is not very good, but where you can see the red arrow, it was an own program or unit under the Conflict Prevention and Early Warning Division. And similarly to CUES with the institutional reform, it has disappeared as an own institution from the organigram. However, the staff members working there continue to work. But this is just to show you that the AU Commission is very much a moving target. A couple of examples what the program actually does. So, for example, it promotes the creation of national border commissions in member states that then kind of decide on border coordinates, demarcate them on the ground. It promotes cross-border infrastructure. So, for example, health centers in a border region that can be accessed, or clinics that can be accessed from communities from both sides of the borders. One-stop border posts to facilitate movement across borders, etc. So, quite a diverse set of activities. And the Commission also produces knowledge and kind of tries to foster learning on these borders. And one way of systematizing this knowledge is the so-called AU Border Information System, which is an online database that kind of collects these GPS coordinates. There's also an online archive that has scans of the colonial treaties. But, the information system is not really used today. And one of the reasons is that member states are quite reluctant to share that information that they consider sensitive information with the AU. So that kind of brings to light the delicate relationship as well between AU and member states, and shows that the Commission cannot move forward with the project if member states are not really on board. And then there are quite a lot of other documents, guidebooks that have been created. Now, what's particularly interesting in these kind of multi-stakeholder programs is that there are these different conceptions, different ideas of the meaning of borders. And I guess you've gathered already from one of the slides before that there's a kind of a conceptual tension in that program, right? So you have one activity that calls for demarcation, so kind of rebordering, having borders being physically visible. And then you have another kind of activity that looks at cross-border cooperation, which is kind of debordering, right? Kind of less borders, and which is more in line with the African Continental Free Trade Area and other kind of aspirations of the AU. And it's kind of mainly the Commission, but also the Federal Foreign Office and GIZ to kind of drive the demarcation, which is also the quantitative indicator, right, if the program succeeds or not. And then you have regional economic communities and also border communities, of course, that do not necessarily see that always as useful. Ooh. All right. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, the generator's gonna take. There we go. Okay. Let's pause the time for a second. Sorry. Yeah, you got on time. the lights can come back on. Marco, just let me know if you're good to go. Oh, okay, cool.
Otherwise, I can.
No, of course, of course.
I wonder if I continue without the presentation.
It's only going to take about a few minutes.
Okay.
Oh, thanks. All right, just give me a second. Let me just quickly make an announcement. I think we have to continue without the presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately the Wi-Fi is giving us a bit of an issue and we are using it to connect it to the projector. But while we're waiting for the Wi-Fi connection to come back, Dr. Constance is going to continue with her presentation and then we'll just continue and resume once the network is back. Thank you. Over to you, Doctor.
Okay, thank you so much. So we just have to kind of imagine kind of zooming into Addis Ababa and yeah. Yes, so there are these kind of, I guess, paradigmatic differences, yes, between the different participants in the program, actors in the program, on what the program is supposed to do, what kind of functions borders have, and that also plays out in their daily interactions and how they negotiate, how that program moves forward. Because it's one thing you have the foundational documents where it says the program is supposed to be doing X, Y, Z, but then the interesting thing is that it kind of morphs over time and kind of changes in its form as well. Now, kind of spending time at the EU campus and kind of observing these daily interactions between GIZ, mostly German staff, and AU staff is quite interesting. And I mean, you can imagine that a workplace is always a place of friendships, competitions, sympathies, antipathies between individuals. So that kind of everyday, these kind of everyday dynamics are quite interesting and do matter, I guess, to that partnership. But also the concept of organizational culture that was already introduced by Professor Engel can kind of help to make sense of, I guess, certain frictions between institutional partners. Because, yeah, GIZ and the Commission have very different organizational cultures, kind of decision-making mechanisms, but also different career incentives of the staff working there. So just a couple of examples. So the border program brings together people from very different, age groups, gender, backgrounds, race. For example, in the EU Commission, the program staff is predominantly male. But then in the GIZ team, there were for a long time quite young team members in an early career stage, often female staff. So those kind of characteristics in terms of seniority, gender, were kind of diametrically opposed. Then career incentive-wise, I guess, GIZ staff gets their targets defined at a headquarter in Germany, but the AU staff is not really bound by those targets, right? But they're kind of subject to their own different kind of internal organizational dynamics that are marked by kind of high job insecurity. I think it's like a lot of short-term contracts in the AU, 60%, I guess, of staff, very high staff turnover, and all of that has apparently worsened with the current reform process. The Commission is also chronically understaffed, partially because recruitment processes take quite a long time. And in the context of the border program cooperation, this kind of led to GIZ staff taking over AU tasks in the long run. And that kind of then also creates that perception that, of a dominant a partner, as well, of course, a perception of limited AU ownership. But we're back. Okay, wonderful. Now, at the same time, there's also, because we're talking about cohesion and working on cohesion, I would argue cohesion created between, these partners in a program, and primarily through intermediaries, for example, POC GIZ personnel, so people of color within GIZ that are being perceived by their African counterpart, AU counterparts as fellow African, and who kind of, know the organizational cultures and habits of both organizations and can translate meaning between both partners and then eventually binding them closer together. So these are just, some of the, because we're speaking of inner life, some of the dynamics that can be observed in the border program. Now, how can we make sense of external partnerships? And I want to, reiterate again, this is of course only one specific example. Now the dynamics with the EU or with, China might look quite different. But, conventionally those global north, global south partnerships are often imagined as quite static and also shaped by neo-colonial dependency, I guess. And this kind of direct link is imagined between the money is coming from there. That means that the influence is coming from the same direction. But when you look at these daily interactions and you're tracing, for example, the knowledge production process, there's actually quite a lot of pockets or forms of agency and contestation that the Commission disposes of and makes use of. And we think in our research that this is really important to acknowledge and to capture. I guess the AU border program is a good example for that. And also what was, just the last point, I think, that was, previously mentioned as well. So it's also important that these organizations are not unitary actors, but that when we speak of, the AU is doing this or GIZ is doing that, they are specific departments, individuals, leadership, policy officers, sub-institutions, and so it kind of, it helps to say, okay, who is actually acting and to differentiate, to kind of unpack that black box of that these actors often constitute or seem to be from the outside. All right, so what is the future for the AUBP? It's a bit difficult to tell, but until this day, or at least until 2021, only 35% of intra-African borders have been demarcated. There might be a bit more now, but the pace is going very slowly, and I guess that also tells us that other political projects are clearly having priority at the moment. Okay, and now, for the last couple of moments, I'd like to just briefly share a little bit more on practical questions of how the AU can be studied. And what the challenges are. So when it comes to sources, written sources are only accessible to a limited extent. Sometimes they do not exist. For example, there are no minutes of meetings that are available for research purposes. But there's a lot of official documentation that is available on the AU website. For example, the summit decisions, press communiques, etc. But they're often not complete or systematized. So that means that supplementary sources are necessary, and one of them is archival work. but also, of course, semi-structured interviews, informal conversations with program staff, etc. And in that context, that trust between researcher and AU staff is quite essential. But also positionality matters very much. So it does matter if you approach the institution, for example, as a white European, or as a person of color, as an African, as a younger or more, with a younger or more senior, age, gender also very much matters. So these kind of identity markers can affect not only the access but also the information that you receive, and of course the interpretation or the kind of lens of interpretation that you're taking. And finally, you can see here on the left side the entrance to the former AU archives. Before, I guess, last year, you could not physically go and search for documents, but you would speak to someone who works at the archives as kind of an intermediary, or, and you would speak to that person, say, this is my research question, this is what I'm looking for, and then that person would disappear and come back with documents. So it would be quite important, of course, also that relationship with these so-called gatekeepers, I guess. And it was, when I was there, I think in 2021, I had a discussion with another PhD researcher who was from a West African country and who did research at the same time at the archives on a different topic. We kind of found out that when I submitted my support request to the archives, I got quite selected scans or PDF files back. Whilst he, for example, he would be called by the colleagues at the archives and would be given to pick up loads and loads of physical documents. And then we were exchanging, that's quite interesting, and I guess it can have to do with, it's possible that it has to do with the research question as well. But I perceived it as kind of a filtered access and a trust question, that I would get very few carefully selected documents, and then he would interpret it as, for him it's a lot more work to go through these documents, so it's kind of a favoritism that I'm getting these selected items. So that kind of goes to say that so these markers, I guess, matter for the information that you receive, but it's also important to reflect on why and what you're getting and what you're maybe not getting, and also how that affects your research process. And you can see on the right-hand side, just very briefly, that the archives have moved now to a new building, so it remains to be seen to what extent that will also change the way that they can be consulted, or the AU can be researched. Thank you very much. Looking forward now to the responses and the comments and the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Constance. Let's please give her another round of applause. Thank you, Doctor. And now we are going to go to the second part of our program, which is the discussants. And I'm not going to be as generous with the time with them, Prof. Ngomezulu, as I call him up. So Prof. Ngomezulu is a full professor of political science and international relations. He is the director of the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy at Nelson Mandela University. He holds 7 academic qualifications. Let me say that again. He holds 7 academic qualifications, 1 junior degree, 2 honors degrees, 3 master's degrees, and 1 PhD. And he was telling me that he's thinking of doing another PhD, so that's quite interesting. And his PhD is from the Rice University in Texas, USA. He has presented about 200 academic papers at national and international gatherings, and has 6 books, 18 book chapters, and several articles both nationally and internationally. His research interests include higher education, international relations, African comparative politics, and traditional leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Professor Ngomezulu. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you very much, Vuyo. I know that this is what happens when you give someone a seat and then it becomes dictatorial. And now it's giving us as little time as possible. But because I'm not the speaker, I am not complaining. I'm just responding to the presentations given, more especially the one given by Dr. Professor Ulf Engel, on the two pieces that he took us through. I'll be very brief given the fact that I'm just responding to issues that most of you are conversant with, so I don't have to do a lot of work. He has done the job for me in that regard. The decision to establish the AU, that is the African Union, was not an event but a process. And I think colleagues have picked this up from his presentation. Such a decision was informed by the realization that its precursor, that is the Organization of African Unity, was in fact no longer achieving the goals it had been set up to do. In other words, it had a cause, therefore it had to be replaced by something else. Ulf describes the period 1999 to 2002 as a transition period in terms of setting up this new body, which was going to fill the gaps, as it were. And then, of course, the process, he outlined it in the slide that he showed earlier on. And then, of course, while the OAU was launched in Addis Ababa, in Ethiopia, the AU was launched in eThekwini or Durban in South Africa in 2002. That's very interesting because most of the activities of the AU happen in Addis Ababa, including the meetings of the heads of government. They happen in Addis Ababa. What we have in South Africa is the Pan-African Parliament, which is located in Johannesburg. Other than that, most of these activities happen in Addis Ababa. Of course, at some point, I hope that Prof. Wolf will tell why this preference of Addis Ababa. Hopefully, if not today, some other time. Then, of course, one of the things that came out openly for me is the fact that Prof. Wolf has worked in this particular institution, and therefore it's given us an inside account of what has happened. So we're getting it from the right person. I don't want to say from the horse's mouth before I'm mistaken to say Prof. Wolf is a horse. Yeah, among the main issues that he shared with us are the following. One, he identified three main issues. One is peace and security. The second, continent's vision. In other words, this is what we're aiming for, Agenda 2063. The aim is to strengthen African agency and multilateralism. With that said, and I then have a question which I would like Prof. Wolf to help us with. In your view, having been adopted in January 2015, how far is the AU from achieving its Agenda 2063 goals? In other words, we've seen it in action. It's been in existence for some time, and it has this Agenda 2063. But in your view and in your assessment, how far are we from achieving the goals of Agenda 2063? Then the next part is on the EU interventions between 2019 and 2020, wherein Prof tells us that different forms of interventions have come to the fore, and he listed a couple of them. Amongst them, I listed three because I can't go through them in the interest of time. One is peace support operations, the second one is preventative diplomacy, and the other one is counter-terrorism. Without necessarily undermining the rest I've left out, given the continued countries in the African continent I've just mentioned. and other AU intervention. Going to go through, they are indicated on page 5 of his presentation, and then he cites sections from Article 12 on the operation of the CEWC on page 7, and then it talks about the implementation dynamics, where it traces the process between 2003 and 2017 on page 9, and then it highlights a couple of things there. Then he moves on to the question, what was lost? In where he identifies 4 areas on page 11 as to what was lost, and he enumerated those areas where things went wrong. And then he moves on to the perspectives, wherein he talks about the top-down approach on the one hand, and then the bottom-up approach on the other. On this one, I would like to have a comment, Prof. From your experience, which option do you align yourself with? That is between the top-down approach and then, of course, the bottom-up approach, and we provided examples of that. Then as I come towards the end, then it talks about the pathologies of international organizations, where it lists financial and human resource constraints, idiosyncratic influences, and ad hocalism, meaning that things are done in an ad hoc manner. And then, of course, legal institutional memory, and then lastly, a culture of firefighting and anticipatory obedience. Given all of these and many other challenges which he might not have had a chance to highlight, the question then becomes, considering these real challenges, what do you think should be done as a way forward? Well, we are now aware of what has happened, then what should we do as a way forward? In conclusion, having been in existence for almost 2 decades now, the AU should have come of age, or should have been closer to achieving that goal. While it is true that giant strides have been made by the AU to address some of the challenges the continent is faced with, a lot still needs to be done. And this is also one of the things that came out clearly from the presentation. The continued political instability in different parts of the African continent point to recurring challenges. In other words, despite all the mechanisms that have been put in place, it appears that some of these challenges are recurring. And the role of the continental and international role players should be interrogated. In other words, not only are we going to look at what we normally refer to as endogenous causal factors or internal factors, but also have to look at exogenous causal factors or external influences. Listening to someone with inside knowledge of the AU processes is refreshing, informative, and capacitating. I think colleagues will agree with me that we learned a lot from the presentation, given the fact that we were hearing from someone who knows how these things work. We thank CANRAD and Prof. Christy van der Westhuizen for hosting these 2 colleagues, and I think you have learned a lot as much as I've done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, thank you very much, Prof. Ngomezulu, and we truly appreciate it. I think you've made my job a bit easier because you kicked off the Q&A session before we even got there. So I truly appreciate that. Now I would like to call upon our next speaker, who is also a discussant, and he's from the Department of History and Political Studies, and he goes by the name of Thomas Terreblanche. Thomas Terreblanche is an emerging academic and is a member of the Department of History and Politics at the Nelson Mandela University. He is a former researcher for the NRF Chair of Ocean Culture and Heritage and has worked as a research and operations manager at the Northern Areas People Development Initiative. His research interests include South African political history, working class formations, township histories, and the sociology of religion. He teaches 20th century South African and African history, as well as ancient history. He holds a bachelor's degree in history and political studies, as well as a master's degree in political studies and history. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you Mr. Thomas Terplanche. Let's give him a round of applause, please. Dr. Terplanche, over to you.
How much time do I have?
Yeah, 10 minutes.
Oh, I've got 10 minutes. Okay, well, thanks so much, colleagues, for the opportunity to be responding to, I think, what is a really brilliant presentation. I think students in the room especially would have been very interested in the inner workings of the African Union. I'm sure many of you would want to work for a Pan-Africanist organization such as the AU. I understand some of the students, some of the PAC students, if I were to listen correctly earlier on, are in the room, so I'm certain especially you are very interested in the working of the AU, and we thank you for the colleagues, Dr. Bloom and Professor Engel, who actually work in the institution and are able to give us, again, like Prof. Becky said, the insider's view of what it means to work in the African Union. Now, the main purpose of the African Union border program, Dr. Bloom, of course, spoke on the inner life of the African Union border control program and its inner workings. And so I would like to start off by asking maybe an ontological question, and maybe, of course, we wouldn't be able to respond to it here, but the broader question, what does it mean to be African? Stemming from the idea that the African Union is created partly in responding to that particular context. My esteemed colleague here on my left presented the topic with great excellence by zooming into three areas: the workings of the border control, African borders as a general concept, as well as a broader critique on the financing of the African Union, as well as the program itself. I would love to, of course, in the spirit of asking questions, will you ask the workings of Germany and Germany's influence? I know you did mention it in part, but Germany's influence in the border program, so to speak. She raises important points during a period of many conflicts in the African context. Of course, perhaps one could also argue that we are, and have been for a very long time, having a new scramble for Africa, as it were. And what about the broader conflicts that comes with that? Of course, I think it has already been mentioned, and I won't repeat it, and I won't go into detail, but of course, Agenda 2063, and what that means within the broader context of borders within the African context. So for my response, I would like to discuss three elements, the notions of borders in the African context. So just a brief historical stroke, as it were. What do African borders look like in a pre-colonial Africa, colonial Africa, and a post-colonial Africa? Because it's also election year in South Africa, I think we should be asking some questions about South African political parties and whether or not they've also asked questions about South African borders, more broadly speaking, the South African or the African border program, as well as funding of the African Union. And then lastly, I'll pose a few questions, if time does permit, for the broader sense and making of African borders and, of course, financing the AU. Now, border disputes have been a major issue in post-colonial Africa. We know that. I mean, it's already been spoken about, but the conflicts between Sudan and Uganda, South Sudan and Sudan, Kenya, Somalia, etc., among the many examples that we can use. I'd like to, of course, state, which has often been a popular discourse amongst or on conflict in Africa, or border conflicts in Africa, is that conflicts or border conflicts are not only limited to the African context. World War I, we can consider World War II, the war in Northern Ireland, etc., etc. So I think it would be incorrect of us then to only mention Africa when we are considering border conflicts, so to speak. Of course, conflicts around borders are new in historical phenomena or phenomenon, especially in modern history. But Africa has a unique issue because, of course, borders were created through artificial mechanisms by that Berlin Conference. So, of course, just very briefly, colonial histories, or colonial borders, what's the notion of borders? Sorry, the notions of borders were not strictly defined in a pre-colonial Africa. One, of course, needs to consider the nomadic people, the Maasai people, the San, the Berbers, etc., etc., who didn't stick to a particular limitation, so to speak. Of course, we also need to consider the frontier of contact, distinct cultural and political groups where borders were created. For example, in the Yoruba states, or the frontier of separation. For example, physical borders, so to speak, like maritime and large pieces of land which were no man's lands during pre-colonial times. And of course, as well as wars of expansion, Mfetane and others, so to speak. Of course, the colonial warfare, I'm not going to go, colonial borders, I won't go into much detail in that. I think most of us should know about the Berlin Conference and the impact of the Berlin Conference on Africa and the creation of borders. Of course, in the post-colonial era, we know of many civil wars, the Biafran War in Nigeria, amongst many others. The wars in Congo, for an example, amongst many others, who causes, as a result rather, of these artificial war. And then, of course, the AOU and the AU have already been spoken about, and their reluctance to create perhaps a borderless world, and so a borderless Africa, so to speak, even though many of the Pan-Africanist leaders, anti-colonial leaders, would push for a borderless Africa. Now let's draw attention very quickly. I know I've got a few minutes. So let's draw attention very quickly to the South African political parties and its context, or at least their perceptions on borders in Africa more broadly speaking, as well as the African Union and the border program. It's important, again, to create a very brief historical context. I can't help it. I teach history. The migrant labor system in South Africa and the ethnic groupings sharing borders in southern Africa. We know that all too well. South Africa's influence in the DRC, South Africa and Sudan, etc., etc. And of course, South Africa being one of the major funders in Africa, as we know, one of the major member states in Africa who are funding the African Union. Of course, most of our funding, as we already come to understand, doesn't come from the African Union. But South Africa is one of the 5, I think, major funders. And as Sankagara says, he who feeds you controls you. So perhaps that's a question that we need to consider. Very briefly, the EFF, as we know, left-leaning party, pan-Africanist in nature, has been pursuing a borderless Africa for a very long time, especially around trade. The ANC has played a critical role, of course, through its president, its former president Thabo Mbeki, in the formation of the African Union. But it seems that some of its leaders have had some xenophobic tendencies. We think of the MSc of Health, I think in Limpopo, if I'm not mistaken. Perhaps one could consider Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi, and perhaps one wouldn't call it xenophobia. I wouldn't go that far, but of course there has been certain iterations among some of its leaders. But it seems that the ANC government primary focus over the last year or so, especially in the Ramaphosa administration, is BRICS and its role in sort of creating a new political, international political environment, so to speak. The DA doesn't speak much about African Union, speaks very little about it, but in fact its main focus is of course in the West, it would seem, especially with these economic treaties, so to speak. I'll finish off in the next 2 minutes, if you may. 1 minute, just 1 minute. And then there's of course parties who seem to be very xenophobic in their approach. The Patriotic Alliance, for an example, and one or two other political parties. And so there is a concern of growing xenophobia in South Africa, especially around what is perceived to be porous borders. So, just in conclusion, a couple of questions. Is it possible to have a borderless Africa? Is it possible to rearrange borders, as may have been the suggestion in the past? Is it possible to manage our borders without external intervention? And then I also noted that there's certain institutional limitations that has hamstrung the project of the AU. And perhaps, Doc, you could speak to some of those things. I'll just end off with this quote by a communist leader. He says, if a factory is torn down, but the rationality which produced it is left standing, then the rationality will simply produce another factory. If a revolution destroys a systemic government, but the systemic patterns of thought that produced that government are left intact, then those patterns will repeat themselves in a succeeding government or a succeeding institution. There's so much talk about the system, but so little understanding. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Let's please give another round of applause to Mr. Thomas Terblanche. Right. Now we have reached the point that we've all been waiting for, and that is the Q&A session. But I don't want to be too bureaucratic. I don't want to abuse my powers as chair. So I will dedicate 25 minutes. 25 minutes for a Q&A session for the session, and I will see if there are any takers. Wonderful. Let's start with Prof. Breakfast, number 1. Odba, please assist me with the mic, please. There's one mic. There's one over there. Wait, Prof. Sorry. I just want to recognize 5 hands. So there's Prof. Breakfast, my leader over there, number 3, number 4, number 5. In that order, please, Odba. Thank you. Oh, and sorry, just one more thing, Prof. Just as you are about to speak, please introduce yourself, your name, your surname, and which department you're from. Thank you.
And then the second question that I have, Prof, is with regard to the historical development of
Thank you, Prof. Number 2, right over there. And Prof Breakfast, I'm assuming that those questions are going to Prof. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Prof. Mdwele. My name is Zubisa Skoko from the Department of History and Politics. I'm a student. I have 2 questions. One is on the fact that there is this instability in Africa, as you all know. So my question is on the effectiveness of the regional structures like ECOWAS and SADC. As you will know that last year when Niger was subject to a coup, ECOWAS intervened and tried to convince the coup leaders to reinstate the democratic government that had been overthrown, but it was defied. Even when it threatened to engage in military operation, it was still defied. So are they effective? And with SADC in Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwe mission observer elections last year, the mission was simply overlooked. It was politically neutralized. Are they effective? The second question is on sort of local. What does it say about AU when political parties like DA skips it and goes straight to US and ask it to come and observe our elections here? What does it say about AU? Thank you.
Thank you, my leader. Number 3.
Good evening. Thank you so much for the opportunity. My name is Mxolisi Nomdlechi. I'm from the Department of History and Politics. He who pays the piper calls the tune. My first question is, I actually have 3. I'll be very quick. My first question is on the gifts. I mean, I'm more interested on the gifts. The first one being the gift to us by China. So China built the African Union building, right? So I would like to know what were the conditionalities. What do we owe to China at this point? And also Germany built Julius Nyerere Peace and Security Building. So what are the conditionalities there also? The second question is, allegedly, Paul Kagame is supporting M23 in Congo. I would like to know from Prof. Engel, as an advisor to the African Union, what is your advice to the African Union on how to handle this situation in the Congo right now? The third question is going to Dr. Bloom. Dr. Bloom, we as Africans, we have a very painful history with Germany, as everybody can know, but as students in South Africa, we actually benefit a lot from organizations from Germany, such as GIZ, KAS, FES. My question to you is, Germany in post-colonial Africa seems to be very present in Africa right now. My question is, what really is Germany's agenda or Germany's interests in Africa right now? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Number 4, on your left, on my left, sorry.
Hi, my name's Gabrielle Chinnison. I'm a 3rd-year politics and economics student. And I have 2 questions which are pretty much linked to each other that I got from Mr. Tablanche's comments. Specifically his question, is it possible to have a borderless Africa? And so within the border program, are there plans to facilitate conversations to help remove xenophobic ideologies within the African continent? like, for example, in South Africa, many people have xenophobic ideas when it comes to foreigners, or even in North African countries like Egypt and Libya, it's not uncommon to find people who have those ideas. And then, building on that question, would the African Union border program be able to move at a faster rate if the governments of African countries put more effort into service delivery towards their citizens? Because the way I think and what I believe is that if governments put more effort into service delivery, that their citizens would have less of a scarcity mindset and would in turn have less xenophobic ideas as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you. And then right behind you, please. Number 5.
Thank you very much. Daniel Oyebode Akintola from Department of Sociology and Anthropology. I'm a student of Biblical and Religious Studies at the PhD level, third year. Yeah, I have about 3 questions to ask concerning the presentation today about AU. My first question goes to the issue of conflict management in Africa. That is happen to be one of the goals that, or one of the duties of AU in Africa. I want to ask, with the situation in Africa, because we have many countries that are experiencing conflict now, with different or a peculiar conflict in each of the countries that are experiencing conflict. Take, for instance, when you look at Nigeria, we have not only one conflict that is existing there. We have political conflict, we have tribal conflict, we have religious conflict. And if you come to South Africa, we have that of political conflict. If you go to Somalia, they have their own peculiar conflict also. And if you go to Sudan, Zimbabwe, Burkina Faso, and so on and so forth. Now, I want to ask, is there a different conflict management committee that AU set up for different types of conflict in Africa? That is my first question. Do you have different setup of conflict management team that you have for a particular conflict, or you just have one team that is attending to all the types of the conflicts we have? Then the second question is, with the long time of AU intervention in conflict resolution in the affected countries, can you point to a single country that AU has succeeded in achieving peace? Can you point to one? Then the third one is, would the unity to achieve in Africa be possible with the presence of borders we have today?
All right.
Political borders that we have today. Because that is separating us. A person like me that happened to be in Nigeria, in South Africa, so I'm seen as a foreigner. So I'm considering to be an international person, whereas I'm supposed to be part of South Africa as an African person. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, my leader. I really appreciate it. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time, so the time remaining now is 20 minutes. So I am going to pull rank, and I'm going to give each speaker, each speaker 5 minutes to respond to the questions that were posed to them. And I am going to start with Prof. Off. Here's the mic, sir. Okay.
It will take me 5 minutes to read out the questions. Okay. Let me start with the last one. And that's an obvious question that often comes. Is there any success of the African Union in dealing with conflicts? Can you show and prove that early warning is working? On the last one, no, you can't. There's no logic way to prove that early warning intervention works. The whole thing is far too complex to argue that one single institution, one agent has been successful or failed. So when you think of the situation in this country in 1994, one could make the argument that the policy of the OAU in the days before, since '63, has been greatly helping the anti-apartheid case. It's not a single action. Right? It's 30 years of permanent policy, aggregating positions by the liberation movements at the level of the frontline states, then bringing it to the United Nations, to the Commonwealth, and so on. So I guess it's not one single place, agent or whatever that we can single out. The AU itself is priding itself in having reached peace or an end of conflict in Ethiopia 2 years ago. There's a public relation argument, I suppose. The real pressure in the background came from the United States and others. Again, far more complicated and complex to discuss. One of the common threads now in the questions is about funding. And let me say, AU member states committed themselves in a parallel financial reform to bring additional funding to the Union through a tax on eligible imports, 0.2%, a levy, which most of the countries are imposing already or introducing. The money that was aimed at has been collected, so that's quite a success, I suppose. But at the same time, member states are kind of reluctant to spend more money for the Union. So there's, on the one hand, a plan to achieve by initially 2020 that member states pay 100% of the budget for staff maintenance and everything, 50% for operational policies, that is introducing, implementing what they want to do, and 25% for AU-led peace support operations. So far, 0% peace support operations, 100%, sometimes with a bit of financial tricks for maintenance, staff and everything, and for the remaining part, 40%, declining. Because at the same time, they introduced a cap on how much AU member states should contribute to the overall budget, the so-called assessed member state contributions, which is now at 200 million, next year 250 again. In combination, there is a finance gap of 164 million in the last budget, and member states are not willing to chip in the money, but rather coming back to a situation where the share of donor funding is increasing again. 66 is the most recent figure. We were down to 48. Related to that debate, of course, is the question of what is the effect of having so much donor funding in the room. And I don't buy into the story with a piper. It doesn't work. For many reasons. Most of these actors don't have a strategic policy vis-à-vis the African Union. If you talk about Germany and you ask this question, there is no single German-Africa policy. There are 20 different African policies next to each other, different actors, and they are not smart enough to pool these resources and interest to impose anything on the African Union. Sorry. They're just a nice donor. There are no strings. And 2 minutes. There are no strings and nothing like that, because they lack the vision of coming up with a proper AU policy. And to be honest, I've worked for 18 years now with early warning, preventive diplomacy and everything. All the terms of reference, all the strategy papers were drafted by the AU, not by the Germans. There's never ever I've seen any important paper where Germany tried to influence policy. They are trying to do other things. That is the administrative process, budgeting, financing, imposing rules. But that's a different thing. It changes the institution as well, that's for sure. Considering the many challenges, what should be done? Let me just highlight, I only have 2 minutes, 4 challenges and 3 answers. The PSC, the Peace and Security Council, by way of the PSC protocol, should have 15 members who are all adhering to democratic standards. This is the AU's decision, not mine. If you look at the countries on the council, they are even less democratic than the African average. So you have the Zimbabwe's, the Algerias, Egypt's on the council, and maybe not the Namibias. Okay, Namibia right now is a member. That's one. The balance of power on the continent has changed in recent years. You mentioned it. We have seen a wave of coups d'etats, so-called unconstitutional changes of government, which has changed the balance and the ability of institutions to push back. We've seen that in ECOWAS now. Initially, Nigeria wanted to intervene militarily. They couldn't make it. and they impose sanctions, and then a couple of weeks ago they have revoked all these sanctions because they are simply not working. Member states increasingly push for sovereignty, which limits and constrains the African Union, which itself is being constrained by the fact that the whole management team, the political team, will change, and people are campaigning for re-election or are lame ducks because they only have 1 year left.
I'm really sorry to do this. Thank you so much, Professor. Yes, please give him a round of applause. Yes, fortunately after this we're going to have refreshments, so there's more than enough time to just engage with one another. Dr. Constance, over to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, maybe also just to add to the funding debate, because maybe with an anecdote, because we always have these two buildings, right? The Chinese building, the German building that we showed, but apparently Germany didn't know that China had already promised something to AU. So AU has 30 partners, so they also have a way of, if one to play. It's very clear. So there's always a leverage of doing something. It is not necessarily because money comes from there. So just to give one example of where there's some flexibility, right? Because you don't have one partner, but you have several partners that you can go to for specific things. And then in the case of the border program, I think what is very clear, when you have this one dominant partner, GIZ, through money from the Foreign Office for 18 years now, right? Which can be seen as something positive because it gives stability to the agenda. So you can continue with that work. And at the same time, you obviously have a little bit of a dependence. But it is an originally African project. So it appeared in the AU Commission's strategic work before ever there was an involvement in Germany. So just to highlight those kind of nuances a little bit that I think are quite interesting when you kind of dive in these kind of partnerships. But continuing with Germany, what is Germany's interest in Africa? Because it's been perceived as more present as earlier, and I would agree. With Professor Engel, I don't see there's one German Africa strategy. There isn't. I think since 2007, there was this G8 summit in Germany where more money was pledged to the AU, and there were certain steps taken and more money given to the Foreign Office to do certain things, but it's not a coherent kind of block again. And you were mentioning FAS and CAS, and I think here as well we can't speak of Germany, but we look at these different actors. FAS, for example, has been in the region for so long, has been working with trade unions, has very different partners, very different, also historical linkages to what they're funding and what they're supporting. So I think it's kind of very important to kind of break down again which kind of actor we're talking about, to see a little bit what their presence in Africa has been and what reasons behind that are. To continue with xenophobia, yes, sorry. Oh, wow, okay. So many questions. Very, very great questions. I haven't seen any document by the AUBP discussing that issue, but that doesn't mean it's not there, but I haven't come across it. Can a borderless Africa be a reality? I think that is, I'm not the right person to answer that, but just to highlight that within the AU border program, there are so many people that work there that really believe in that, right? So it is it has kind of morphed into this very technical program of GPS data and whatnot, but at the origin of the foundation of this program were a lot of civil society influence, were a lot of border children that continue to work in this program from AU and GIZ side that really believe in that reality. But then of course kind of, how you have an idea and then it gets bureaucratized and it turns into an institution, and then the timeline and direction can change. I think I have 30 seconds. I wanted to also respond to your, but I think we can maybe do that then bilaterally as well over a bit later. Yeah, just to thank you then. And yeah, sorry for the questions that haven't been addressed, but hopefully you're all staying with us and we can discuss later.
Thank you very much, Dr. Constance. Let's please give her a round of applause. And like I did say, I really hate to be bureaucratic, but I promise you we will discuss these issues during lunchtime. Sorry, during the snacks, yes. Prof. Ngomezulu, please. Okay, perfect. Thomas? Okay, so yeah, that is unfortunately the end of our Q&A session. Thank you so much. Let's please give the participants another round of applause, please. I think we're still good on time. And yeah, so the next person that we have on our program is none other than Professor Breakfast, who is going to be giving us the vote of thanks. It's up to you, Prof. I will give you the mic. So Professor Breakfast is going to be doing the vote of thanks, and then afterwards we can go grab some food.
On a lighter note, you know, it's always a challenge to address an audience of this nature when it is about to address the national question, which is the question of poverty. So I will try my level best not to hold you back, because the national question is idling on the outside. But anyway, be that as it may. Thank you very much, colleagues, for joining forces with us. I think we are really enjoying this relationship, and I hope that we build upon it between ourselves and yourselves. You know, one of the gaps in our curriculum design and development as a department is that we don't have a module on security. And I hope that, Prof, you can help us to bridge that gap. We also don't have a module on strategic studies and so on. I also think that one of the gaps in the public discourse in this country is that the issue of foreign policy, African politics, international relations, those debates are not exhausted. Seriously. So I really hope that, you know, debates of this nature can even be taken out there in the marketplace, but also we can extend an invite to other intellectuals outside this space. I think without any further ado, I'm going to hand over the mic to my colleague. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our program. Once again, we truly appreciate your presence. Thank you so much to Professor Ulf Engel, to Dr. Constance Bloom, Professor Ngomezulu, as well as Mr. Thomas Terreblanche. Indeed, it was a very fruitful discussion, and we learned a lot from you. We sincerely hope that we'll have another one of these sessions coming up very soon, Prof. Christie. And yeah, that brings us to the end of our session. Thank you so much. Please network as much as possible, exchange details, exchange ideas. That's what the space is about, and we're truly grateful to have you here. Let us go and address the national question. Thank you.